Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today I'm in conversation with Connecticut poet Joseph R. Adomavicia. A resident of Waterbury, Joe has been a licensed CNC machinist for more than a decade. For the uninitiated among us, of which I count myself, that translates to computer numerical control machinist. Complementing that career is his work as a scribe. He has currently published 3 collections of poetry: A Step into My Heart, most recently in an updated Blackout edition, Love Unbound, and Sakura. The latter features Japanese-style poetry written in 4 different forms. Joe's work has also been included in the Z Publishing House anthologies Connecticut's Best Emerging Poets 2018 and 2019, as well as America's Emerging Poets 2018. Additionally, his poems have received publication honors in multiple issues of Naugatuck Valley Community College's Fresh Ink magazine. It's an impressive list of accomplishments, especially considering he's been writing poetry for less than a decade. It's also a reminder that words matter and that empowerment and strength can come from pain and vulnerability. Listen in now as Joe Adomavicia shares the inspiring story of how he found his voice. It may just help you discover your own. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Central Booking. I am excited to be in the company of Connecticut's poet, Joseph Adomavicia today. He is the author of 3 collections of poetry, one of which is this really cool A Step into My Heart that is available in a Blackout edition, and 2 other collections of poetry as well, which we will talk about a little bit later. But welcome to the show, Joe. I appreciate you being here.
Hi, John. I appreciate you having me here.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I'm kind of excited because the fun part of this show for me is I get to be a little bit more eclectic, and I think that this is episode 24, and you were the first poet that I've spoken to, or at least the first writer who is primarily a poet, though I know that some people do that on the side. So I love that I can, do something other than mystery, thriller, suspense. So thanks for being game to do this, and we'll see, if I embarrass you or myself.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, most likely I'll embarrass myself, but I thought I would, sort of start with the obvious. I want to ask you to what do you credit your affinity for poetry? Were there specific poets that spoke to you? Was this something that came to you gradually, or did you just kind of know?
So that is a vast question. So I started writing because I lost a good friend of mine about 10 years ago, and I understood that he couldn't be here with me. So I took something that he was and let it live through me. He used to be an English teacher, so I decided that, okay, let me have my outlet be poetry, and then Dwight will live on through me. As for the writers that I really had an affinity towards, it would be Robert Frost and Charles Bukowski. Those 2 really stood out to me.
Nice.
Yeah.
I like Robert Frost. I feel like he's very accessible. It's funny because I read a lot of poetry and I really enjoy poetry, but I like the stuff that you can get into and you don't have to spend too much time, trying to read between the lines. And I mean, I felt that obviously through your poetry. I think it's pretty transparent, poignant, but transparent. And I can relate to that because same with music. I like lyrics that I can get into relatively easily and without, a whole lot of brain hurt. But anyway, I digress, and I do that a lot. But I did want to ask you too, so you've come to writing poetry a little bit more recently, and you just, told us sort of what the inspiration was for that. And I think that's really quite a poignant way to remember your friend, and I am sorry for that loss. But again, I think, it shows that out of darkness can come light, and out of bad things, can come good things. And I think that what a way to channel his memory. But so going back to your early days of, starting to dabble in poetry, do you have memories of, those first poems that you wrote or those first experiences of trying to take those ideas and translate them onto the page?
I do. So A Step into My Heart, the first edition came out about 6 years ago, and I started writing about a year prior to that. And I remember just writing little notes down on notepads or in my notepad application on my phone and sharing it with my friends. I was very new to it, so I really didn't know much. So I bought a Poetry for Dummies book and kind of self-taught myself a little bit, took a class, and then that's where it all started. It all started at a little notepad, and just that's my memories of the beginning.
Sure, that's really interesting. So you weren't really, were you a reader of poetry growing up, or this all has just happened in the last decade or so?
It all happened in the last decade. I really didn't read much poetry other than what they taught us in school, which
Sure.
was a little bit of Edgar Allan Poe,
Right.
things like that. So I really wasn't versed in poetry at all
Sure.
until recent.
Interesting. It's funny, I still remember taking a creative writing class in high school, and there was a poetry unit where everybody basically had to, package a certain number of poems, and they gave you, the formats that you had to use. And the teacher was funny and she was great, but she always said that it was always the student's favorite project and her least favorite because it was just also depressing and maudlin. And she's like, everybody loves it because they can finally get out, all those things that they're feeling that they're not showing outwardly, but then I have to read them all. And of course too, how do you really grade somebody on that when everybody's sort of vomiting their emotions at you? But that's always kind of stuck with me. So in asking you about your relationship to poetry, do you find that you like free form? Do you like the forms that already exist? Because some of it's very structured, some of it is, it can be really whatever you want it to be. So how do you grasp those different things and sort of reconcile whether it's going to be a structured poem or something more free?
Honestly, for me, John, it's really about what I'm feeling that day. So when it came to a step into my heart, it was just like you said, all my emotions on the page. I really didn't think about anything except for a couple poems, and I wrote a sonnet or something like that. But otherwise, I just try to keep it fresh. Like with Love Unbound, I chose a totally different topic range. And then with Sakura, I love the Japanese culture of poetry, so I decided to do that. I really like to change it up and keep it fresh for myself and as well as my readers.
Sure. And I wanted to ask you too, and I don't know if you feel a relationship between, writing poetry and music. I know that a lot of people, see lyrics as sort of a form of poetry. And I know that when I'm writing poetry, I think of it as lyrics because I usually, hear a cadence or a rhythm in my head, and I don't necessarily think that I'm writing a poem. But then when other people, maybe see it, they think that it's a poem, whereas to me it exists as something else. Do you have a relationship with music as it pertains to your own writing or no?
I do. I listen to music every day at work, at home. I read and study different lyricists so I can learn what they do and kind of apply it to my own writing in my own way. I learn how to channel my energy, my feelings, whether it's sad, happy, whatever it may be. I've learned to kind of channel myself through my music into my poetry.
Sure. I always wonder if I call it lyrics because then nobody can say, you don't fit this form or that function because I'm never quite certain what I'm writing. And it's funny, I remember that there are all these forms for poetry in addition to the free verse. I just don't necessarily remember what they all are. And I haven't picked up that, Poets for Dummies book, but I probably should because I would sort of like to get back into that a little bit more. But something you said, tapping into your emotions. I wanted to ask you about that because some people say that it's a lot easier to tap into sort of the darker negative emotions. Other people will say they find it more liberating to write when they're in more of a state of contentment. Do you find that it's easier if you're more contented or more discontented, or it can be either way for you?
So if I'm discontented, I find that my thoughts are less organized and I tend to just kind of write everything out on the page in no order. It's just I write, and then I kind of just shift it into a poem.
Sure.
Whereas if I'm contented, I try to hone my thoughts and find particular subjects that I want to write about. Or like on social media, what I've been doing is I have other people submit topics and then I write for them. So that's been kind of my way to balance that between my own personal feelings and then writing for pleasure, if that answers your question.
Sure, yeah. And to sort of piggyback on that, when you're saying you're writing from a discontented place, your thoughts tend to be a little bit more scattershot. What is your revision process like for writing a poem? How do you come back to something and try to rein it in if you feel like it's not in the place that you want it to be?
I've had professors always tell me that if you have a large poem, it's like a two-thirds rule. You can decrease the amount of words and refine it to a smaller piece of poetry, a more concise piece. And that's how I try to handle it. I try to be respective to my own emotions, so I'm not watering it down because it's still cathartic to me. But then I respect the rules of some of the rules of poetry that, it needs to be a concise, clear thought. So that's how I feel about that.
Sure. And I talk to a lot of people, who tend to write longer form, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, and the idea of, killing your darlings comes up again and again and again. And it's always the line that you think is really great that they're like, yeah, if you really have an affinity for it, just cut it right out because somebody else is going to do it for you. But it's interesting to get a perspective because a lot of people, I think, assume that poetry is easy to write because it's short. And that always drives me crazy because there's also that thought that, oh, well, you're writing a book for children and it's a pictures book and it's short. But a lot of times that can actually be more difficult because you have to grasp really, complex concepts and emotions simply in a shorter amount of space. So do you have feelings on that? Do you write things that are longer than your poetry?
So sometimes I tend to, if it's something political, I definitely have a lot to say and it becomes a longer, like more of a slam poem.
Right.
But I definitely agree with you. The shorter poems where you have to be more concise and specific with your words are, I think, more difficult because you don't have that freedom where you would in free verse or some of the longer verses. So I definitely understand and feel that because even with the haikus, you have 17 syllables that you can pick, and it's not very easy. So that's why you'll see me sometimes I'll make the title flow into the 3 lines to kind of cheat the structure. But it works, and it like you said, it's difficult, but it makes you think and really pick your words.
Sure, it's true. And it's funny. Sometimes if I'm having a creative dry spell, I'll be like, all right, maybe if I write some poetry or lyrics, that'll, sort of spark me a little bit. And I'll be like, why not write a haiku? Because that's short. And every time I fall into that trap, I'm like, John, you were an idiot because yes, it's short, which just means it's that much harder to do, or at least that much harder to do well. You don't have to comment on that, but that's just, something that I found over time is a lot of times when you think that you're, embracing something simple, you're really not.
No, you're right, and especially being someone that reads a lot of novels and things like that, I think personally that's a big leap to something like poetry because I think they're vastly different. I've I've never even attempted to write a short story or a novel because I find it intimidating. That's why I stick to poetry. But that's just me, you know.
I was going to say, I'm sure there are other people who say they would never pick up a pen and try poetry, but they'd much rather, write a 500-page novel because they don't have to restrain themselves all that much. So let me ask you too. If I understand correctly, you've sort of said that you see yourself as a conduit to your poems, and they sort of work their way through you. Is that an accurate sort of description of your creative process? And if so, can you elaborate a little bit on that?
I think definitely that is how it happens because sometimes my emotions just flow out onto the page and I feel like other people inspire me in other events and seasons and animals. So it all comes to me and then that little, it's like the light bulb goes off in my head. I think the words, I feel them, it starts like as like a lump in the throat and then all of a sudden I start writing and it's there. So that's where that whole idea of the conduit, and I think that's from my bio where I mentioned that the poetry flows through me endlessly for all the world to see. That's where I really stand on that because it is very true to my life. So that's my way to let everybody in. So I just, when the levee breaks, that's what we have. We have English poetry.
Sure. And I wanted to ask you too, about the idea of inspiration. And obviously, sometimes ideas come through you, and other times I assume, there might be a specific topic that you want to address. So can you talk about the difference between something coming through you, with that sort of natural organic flow, and then trying to sort of wrestle with a topic that doesn't come that naturally, but it's something that's really compelling for you to address?
So yeah, if it doesn't come naturally like that, I think going back to more of the political aspects and things like that. So that stuff that requires more thought and more research and things like that. So that's how I tackle something like that if it doesn't come naturally. So if it's something I feel really passionate about, but I haven't found the words for it yet, I'll research, I'll I'll make it happen that way. It becomes more of like a college assignment or something like that. And that's really how I tackle that if it doesn't come naturally like the conduit. But that's that's where I really think I stand on that. That's how it's happened, or at least how I've noticed in the past 6 years.
Sure. Now, I want to ask you sort of a subjective question, but in terms of your writing and your reading, and I'm sure that there are all kinds of factors that can play into this, including, emotions at the time, sort of the climate of the world. But in your opinion, what makes a good poem? One, is you as the writer, how do you know that you've hit on something that you feel is good? But also, what makes a good poem for you as a reader when somebody else is writing something? Again, with the understanding that obviously it's going to be subjective.
So when it comes to reading somebody else's poem, I look for the way it makes me feel, and if it wasn't concise, did they really get their point across? But I wouldn't go and say that there are bad poems because, like you were saying before, with the teacher or the professor, you're reading something that is the very essence of many of the people writing it. So it's kind of hard to be like, oh, that's not too good, or no, you're going to get an F on that.
Right, yeah.
So when I read like that, it's kind of like, okay, if it doesn't, if it doesn't relate to me and I don't think it's a great poem, it might be to somebody else. So I try not to judge it that harshly, but certain poems that really hit home for me, those are, I feel like they did their job. When it comes to me writing, sometimes I just kind of edit later. So, I mean, it's hard for me to sit here and say my poetry is great because I know not all of it's great, but I know I have that passion for it. So to me, in that way, it's great for me just as it is for somebody else writing.
Sure. And, point well taken, what is a good poem versus what is not, because, I do a lot of reviewing and I try not to be overly critical. And again, I tend to review novels. I don't have the opportunity to review a lot of poetry. But being a writer or an aspiring writer myself, I haven't published a novel, but I've, worked towards novels and I've written some short stories. So I think you can really have an appreciation of the energy, the blood, sweat, and tears that goes into it. So even if something doesn't necessarily work for you, I think you can empathize with the author and understand a little bit better what they were trying to achieve. And also, that it probably is going to reach somebody who it needs to reach, depending on what moment they're in themselves. But I had somebody say to me once, I was asked to write an article about what my approach is to reviewing. And one of the comments that a reader left was, well, it sounds like you're a fan. I said, well, yeah, I mean, why would I want to spend all this time and energy reading things and then writing about reading these things if I didn't like them to begin with? And that doesn't mean that I can't offer some constructive, criticism or feedback. But at the same point, I can appreciate the effort that went into it, knowing that I myself probably can't craft anything like that. So, it's interesting because we do so quickly categorize things as good or bad, but again, it's a very, very subjective topic, I feel. But something else I wanted to get into with you, if you don't mind, that I sort of find interesting, if you can tell us a little bit about, your day job, because a lot of people will say that you either fall into, the reading, writing brain, or you fall into the scientific mathematical brain. But in your day job, you're very much the mathematical scientific person. And then in your poetry, you have that creative outlet. So can you talk about those two different aspects of themselves and how maybe, writing the poetry balances out that other side of you?
Yeah. So it's funny you mentioned that. I like this question when I read about that. So when I was in middle school, I knew that I wanted to follow in my older brother's footsteps as a manufacturer. So when I got to high school, I was able to go on work-based learning, and he got me a job when I was 16. And then a couple years later, about 4 years later, I started writing, so they kind of flowed into each other. But from manufacturing to the mathematical sense to the literary sense, I feel like they help each other. Because at work, I'm forced to be concise. I'm working with thousandths and tenths of an inch. So I don't have a choice but to be specific. So when I go and apply that mindset to my poems, John, I won't release a poem if I don't like the way it's structured, the line lengths, the very specific punctuation of the words at the end of the line. So I'm I'm very mathematical in my poetry. And then with things like haiku and Japanese style poetry and sonnets, it's all about math. So it all comes full circle to me. So this is great. So my first passion has kind of gone right into, like, flowed right into my second passion. And now I have the duality in my life. I just have the two lifelong passions that I've always wanted to do. So
Yeah,
that's
that's great. And it's true because you don't necessarily think of it that way, but they really do sort of feed into each other. And something I really, appreciated about some of your poems is they do work in, sort of scientific concepts and mathematical equations. And it's not something you would necessarily expect to see, but it works. And it's then you read your bio and you say, well, of course, it all kind of comes together. But as you explain how and why that is, I think that that kind of makes perfect sense. Because there is sort of that economy of wordage, when you're writing poetry. And obviously, like you said, it's to the finest detail in the work that you do all day long. So you already have that attention to detail.
it reminds me of Robert Frost. Now I'm not saying I'm Robert Frost because that'd be ridiculous, but Robert Frost, when he lived in Boston, he used to work on a farm, and he has a poem that need to be versed in country things. So to read Robert Frost's work, you kind of need to know the type of life he lived. So I feel like that, you noticing the manufacturing aspects is an important thing because that's where I drew some of that inspiration from to add that to my poetry. So I think it's a pretty cool aspect.
No, I think it's great. I think that one of the most, fun things as a reader is to sort of to learn about the people that I'm reading and then approach their work and sort of see the things in there that are representative of themselves, even if it's fiction. A lot of people will say fiction tends to be, more true to the person than nonfiction because it's a little bit more, unconscious. But you will, see aspects of personality or background. And I think it's fun to sort of try to put the puzzle together. So even just knowing a bit about your background before I read your poetry books was interesting. And I think it made me a little bit more engaged because, of course, I try to relate what I'm reading to the person. I think that with poetry, maybe that's a little bit easier to do in some senses. But that actually leads me to a topic that I did want to ask you about because, to write poetry, you tend to have to be, very vulnerable and self-expressive. So is it difficult to take these very strong feelings that are very, private and internalized to you and then release that to the world and share that with the world and people who might know you, but not necessarily know all the thoughts that are going through your mind?
Yeah, so over the timeline of me writing, I was a very shy and quiet person. My first poem that I ever got published at Naugatuck Valley, Cerulean Wings. I submitted it to their literary magazine. It got accepted. When I read that poem in front of that little auditorium, my knees were shaking. I was sweating. I was nervous. But now it's kind of that vulnerability has taught me that when I go to these events and I'm speaking to people about my poetry, we like the same thing. So is there really need to be afraid? So I've kind of gotten over that. And the more open mics that I've gone to or hosted, or I was the person reading, I've kind of gotten used to the vulnerability, and whether people like it or they don't, it's okay because we're all entitled to our own opinion in that aspect. So that vulnerability has helped me grow as a person, not just with my poetry. So once I learned to embrace it, I think that's where I really matured into myself as a writer.
Sure, and I think it gets back to sort of your point before about how your writing allows you to experience sort of the dualities. Because yes, on the one hand, you can be very vulnerable, but embracing that and sharing that can also be, I would assume, very empowering for a person. Take this and say, "This is who I am. This is what I stand for. Whether or not you like it or agree, like this is it."
Yeah, take it or leave it. You got to.
Right. And I wanted to ask you too, so I'm assuming, a lot of your work is autobiographical and you're writing about people that you know, feelings that you've experienced, but I would assume as well that there are times, that you allow yourself a little bit more liberty to try to, work things out that maybe you haven't experienced. So can you talk about how you embrace writing things that are very specific to you versus things that maybe you haven't experienced? And do you find that, your readers think that everything that you've written is 100% true to what you've experienced?
That's a good question. So when I approach the things that are really personal to me, I mean, they've hit me on some type of emotional or mental level. So that's where that comes from. But when it comes to other things and just writing like the haikus for other people, I really try to put myself in their situation and find out why they wrote or why they submitted that topic so I can write it from their perspective. So that's how I go about that. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of how I go about it.
No, I think that's great. And again, people think that, writing poetry and a novel are so different, but that answer there tends to make me think that there are more similarities because when you were writing about, people and experiences other than yourself or your own, it's almost like method acting where you're putting yourself, in that person's place and then channeling them through you, which I think is really interesting. But again, it shows sort of the complexity of the creative process there. But I did want to ask you, you mentioned, I know online, you write haikus and people can sort of submit ideas for you that you draw inspiration from. Can you talk about social media and your relationship with social media and how that has, either helped or hindered your process and your ability to reach readers?
Yeah, sure. So with social media, it's helped me reach out to people and really find my purpose as a writer. I'm learning that okay, writing for myself and the cathartic aspect is really good. It helps me psychologically. But if I can go online, meet new people like yourself or anybody else that I write for and come across in a day's time, I can help them and maybe make them smile or make their day better. And that to me as a person is fulfilling. So my purpose as a writer with social media has really grown because now, I'm not really posting all of my full length poems or things personal to me. It's all about my readers. And honestly, some of the messages I get of how happy it makes people, that's what it's all about to me. Like I really haven't had many book sales because of COVID and things like that, which is fine. If I wanted to do it for money, I could have been a lawyer or a
Right.
doc. I do it because I'm passionate about it. And in the meantime, if I'm doing the little donation things where I send things out to people or I'll send a shirt and they're happy, that's what it's all about me. I feel like I'm serving my purpose as a fellow human, as a fellow person. And that's really how social media has helped me. Sometimes it can be a little overwhelming with different climates and different things going on there, but we all have to express ourselves in one way or another. And that's what I'm doing in my way.
Sure. And I did want to ask you too, obviously we're living in very unsettled times. And I know I talked to a lot of people who have said that either, they're finding it easier to write or more difficult. They're finding it easier to read or more difficult. And there seems to be a divide, based on people's very understandable anxieties and stressors. Can you talk a little bit about, how current circumstances have influenced your own reading and writing and creative process, if at all?
Yeah, it has because in certain instances that if I see something that really upsets me is upsetting other people, I feel as a writer I need to write about it and express myself and put myself in other people's shoes and learn how to empathize with other people. It really teaches you about who you are as a person when you understand somebody else and what their point is. So that's where I am on that. I mean, it is very difficult. The climate has changed from just 7 months ago. It's like okay, the world was a little crazy then, and here we are 7 months, and it's a little bit crazier than we ever thought it could be. So sometimes it could be more difficult to read online. I can understand that perspective, but then sometimes if it's cathartic to you or you need that writing, I think that writing community sticks together and they rely on each other to read each other's work and help you get through the day.
I think that's true, and I feel very fortunate. Like I have some friends who are passionate readers who haven't really been able to engage, with a book the same way that they had before. And I feel very lucky. My experience has been, the exact opposite. I find myself wanting to read more, and I'm reading later and staying up, until hours that I haven't seen, probably since I was like 15 or 20 years younger. And I'm like, oh, thank God. I feel terrible for the people who can't, who don't have that escapism. Because even when I'm reading about really, really terrible, dark things, they're not the terrible, dark things necessarily that are happening around me. So it's just interesting, but I feel very fortunate, that we have an outlet. And I did want to ask you about that too. A lot of people struggle with self-expression and with finding the courage to be creative or the time to be creative. So if you were asked, what advice, would you give to people who are struggling to find their voice? I mean, they're maybe compelled to express themselves in some creative way, but they don't know, how to do it, when to do it. You've obviously been doing it for many years now. So what would you say to those people?
It's like Nike. You just got to do it. I mean, seriously, I tell myself all the time, as afraid as I have been to express myself or put something down, you have to face what you fear. You have to face your emotions or whatever's going on. So my advice would be is to take a deep look inside yourself and ask yourself, do you really want this? And if you really want it, you're going to do it. You're going to do everything in your power and your passion and in your environment to do so. And I think that's where I've come with my books. I mean, John, I was in a very dark place when I published A Step Into My Heart, and it made me feel 100 times better that I was able to express myself and face those demons, and just, I was able to breathe. So that's my advice to the person struggling to find themselves. Just don't rush it. You can do it if you put your mind to it.
Sure. And I think I said at the beginning that I did want to come back to your three collections and talk about them, both collectively and singularly, if you don't mind. So I figured maybe we can go, book by book and talk a little bit about what the similarities are in the collections, but also the differences, because I think that they stand together in some ways, but obviously each book, has a different theme. Like the first book, A Step Into My Heart, I would say is probably your most eclectic, collection. So can you first talk a little bit about that book specifically?
Yeah, sure. So a Step Into My Heart, that's my baby, so to speak. I those poems in that book, I mean, they were I feel like the poems in that book are my most raw and authentic to myself, because I wrote with myself in mind, and I didn't really all the outside noise, I just let it be outside noise, and I just wrote. I didn't worry about what my professors had to say about editing and all that other stuff. I just did it. And I really am excited to hear that you found it to be my most eclectic piece of works, because that's what it really was meant to be. It's literally a step into my heart. And going further, I'm going to have the sequel to that book take a step further. So I'm going to continue that theme of, okay, I have this range of years that I wrote, and it's going to encompass all those emotions. So whomever picks it up, they might, hey, this poem really, struck a chord, or they can find another one that struck another chord, So that's really my approach with that book. And I really wanted to play with different forms and whatnot. So I have the blood, sweat, and tears, where I have the concrete poetry, where I have the blood drop in it.
Right.
Or I have the Shakespearean sonnet, because I thought writing a sonnet would be cool, until I realized how hard it is. I don't know if you've experienced that. That is difficult.
It is. I had to write one in my life, and I said never again.
Yeah, I mean, I've only written a couple, but all the, the unstressed to the stressed syllables, oh man, I don't need to tell you. It looks like you already know.
That will blow your mind.
Yeah, I don't know what Shakespeare was thinking back then, but a lot of those poems, man. But that's a step into my heart. Now with the Blackout edition, I actually have a hardcover, so I'll show you the hardcover of the book.
Right. Yep.
Version of it. I re-released it because I went independent, and I always thought blackout poetry or eraser poetry was really cool. So I was like, you know what? I'm not going to re-release the same book with different artwork. That's kind of cookie cutter. So I applied that to it, and I came up with the idea, I read one poem, flip the book around, read the blackout version. But the cool thing about that book is, I don't know if are you familiar with Jack Kerouac?
Yes. Yep.
So he wrote a book called Mexico City Blues, and it is a book compiled of about 200 unnamed verses. It's just chorus 1, chorus 2, chorus 3. And the idea was that it's like a stream of consciousness. They don't necessarily flow and subject into each other, but each poem is connected in their own way, and it stands alone. Right. So not only can the Blackout edition be read, okay, I read the white page, flip it around, read the back page. You can also read it from start to finish as its own entire piece. So that's what the inspiration behind the Blackout edition was.
Yeah, it's really cool to read, and it's funny because, until you explained that, I mean, I read it from beginning to end, and then flipped the book and read the Blackout edition from beginning to end, and it never even dawned on me to flip the book and read the first version and then and then the Blackout edition. But now that makes me want to go and read it again, which I probably will. But the Blackout edition is really interesting because either you're taking a poem that already exists in its very simple form and simplifying it even more into its absolute essence. Or in some cases, it's almost like a completely different poem and message. So can you talk about the duality of that a little bit? I'm just going to call you Mr. Duality.
Duality. That's pretty cool. There was the reason why I did that is so it can be read in multiple ways, so more people can read it and maybe empathize with it in a different way. But when I really broke down the poem to its one sentence where it could have been about 100 words or so, I did that because I really wanted that message to get through to my reader. So if you didn't get it throughout the whole first piece, you definitely got it when you flip it around. And then, like I said, they flow into each other. So I kept that essential meaning to the poem. I wanted to keep that in the Blackout version. I just simplified it. So when you do read the Blackout version of the book, it will flow and you'll still get that feeling through the new story, so to speak.
Sure. And then you have Love Unbound, which is very much more thematic. So can you talk a little bit about that? And I will say I was paying enough attention that I recognized some of the poems from the first book that made it into this collection. So I said, all right, John, you were paying attention. But so can you talk about releasing a collection like this that really is tied by the theme of love? It's not as eclectic as the first book, but that sort of almost makes it feel that much more personal.
Yeah, so that was the intent. So when I released Love Unbound, it was actually dedicated to my girlfriend at the time, and I found myself writing her handwritten love poems, and it felt really good. It came naturally. So I was like, you know what? If I take some of the poems that I wrote in the first book and then that didn't make the first cut, then I can have something that I can dedicate to the person I love. And that's where I went with Love Unbound. The reason why I, recycled those poems is because when I wrote the love poems in the Step Into My Heart, I really didn't have anybody to write them to. So they weren't dedicated to anybody. So when I wrote the poems for her at the time, I dedicated the book to her as an entirety. And that's what I came up with. It was really the feelings that I was in for the last 3 years that inspired that book.
Sure. Yeah, and I think too, anybody who's been in that type of relationship, sometimes with a little bit of distance, you forget those feelings. And I found myself, remembering. I mean, I've been with my wife for a very long time, and I used to write a lot of poetry, and I used to write a lot of poetry to her, and not as much anymore. I'm like, man, you suck, John. Why don't you, do that anymore? But it was interesting, to go back and revisit the freshness of a relationship where everything is sort of so new and so passionate, because you're really getting to know each other, and that's a whole process. But it really, anybody who's experienced that type of first love will very strongly, I think, relate to the book. It almost made me want to start writing again. But then you also have, this cool little collection, Sakura, which is based on 4 different forms of Japanese poetry. So one, can you quickly define what those 4 forms of Japanese poetry are, and then talk a little bit about the content of this book?
Yeah, so a haiku is a 3-line poem with a syllable structure of 575, and it's usually a juxtaposition of imagery. So how I write my haiku, if it's a seasonal based haiku, let's say, the first 2 lines will be the stand only lines, and then the last line will kind of be, that'll be the juxtaposition in that poem. If I sang it correctly, the Sinryu is the same structure as a haiku, but it's more so about the ironies of life and life in general. And the other one, I'm going to reference my book.
Sure.
If I'm not mistaken, I used tanka. A tanka, yep, is a 5-line poem with a syllable structure of 57577, which I thought was really cool because it's like a haiku or a senryu, but I have that freedom of adding a couple more lines at the bottom, and it's not as strict in content. So it was even more interesting to write that.
And then Twitter gave you extra characters. It's like,
yeah, cool. And then for the choka, That one, I'm going to read it. Achoka is a form of Japanese-style poetry that does not have a set amount of lines, but is carried out in alternating lines of 5 and 7 syllables, only ending with an extra 7 syllables. That one was something that I found from like Writer's Digest. I thought they give you like prompts and whatnot, and I was like, that's really cool, and I'm gonna try it. So I know the first one is only 7 lines or so, but the other one that's really long, advice from a friend, and that was really fun to write because it really challenged me as a writer. Writing that long of a poem with that much structure and keeping it thematically parallel, it's pretty challenging. So, I mean, for that sequel, I have a sequel for all 3 of these books, by the way.
Oh,
So
great.
I have Take a Step Further. I'm going to do Love Unbound Blackout Poetry Edition. And then I'm going to have Second Bloom. Now, Sakura, it loosely translates to many cherry blossoms. So in this book, I chose small structured poems because they're my cherry blossom petals that make this book, this tree, this whole idea of my book. And with Second Bloom, being that the cherry blossom trees are really short lived in their seasons, I'm going to have that second bloom. And what I'm doing with all the people that submit poetry, it's literally going to be a book in dedication to my readers. So I'm going to have everybody's name at the bottom of the poem, inspired by, if you submitted once, submitted by John Valeri, and that's what it would be. It's really going to be in dedication. But it was really fun to write these 3 books because, like you said, they are all really different, but they're authentic to me too. So it's been a great ride writing these books, and I can't wait to share my new poetry with everyone too.
I know we're all waiting for it, but it's great, and it's funny too because you're explaining this book, which again seems small and simple, but then you get the thought and the intent behind it, and you really realize the complexities that really go into a collection like this, or a collection that you might have coming out soon. And I wanted to ask you too. So you've been at this for about a decade now, and reflecting on the writing that you've done, have you seen an evolution in your style? How do you think that your poetry and your relationship with writing has changed in that time, if it has?
It has changed. It's become more refined. I feel like from A Step Into My Heart till now, I've become more of a critic in a way because I've learned more, and I've had more experience with getting hundreds of poems rejected and learning why they've become rejected and how I can do better. So I apply those aspects to my poems. I'm a little more choosy now than I was 6 years ago because I really didn't care what anybody said. But now that I'm listening more and opening my horizons a little bit, it's like, oh, if I do this, now I see why they're suggesting that. It's like about a month ago, I submitted 2 poems to an online journal, and they offered feedback. And man, when I got that feedback back, it was literally like 6 pages of written words from 2 different editors. I'm like, man, they really didn't like this. But when I went through it and they shared their expertise, I was like, wow, it really like blew my mind. I was like, man, I can really use this to become a better writer. And that's how I've been trying to take it poem by poem, I just apply the things that everybody's been gracious enough to teach me,
Sure. And I think that's great. I mean, if you can be open to constructive feedback, as long as the feedback is constructive, there is such an opportunity to learn. And I found that myself, that every once in a while, if I get some strong, editorial feedback, I've had people who've been afraid to give it to me, but it's been the absolute best, learning experience, and kind of exhilarating too, because I think that we all just, want to be better, or, our better selves. But so before we go, and I have to say, I'm going to tell people that you told me this is your first Zoom interview, but you were on it, man. You were very good at this.
Thank you very much.
That conciseness of words, it comes through your poetry, but it's also your person. But I did want to, ask you, for people who are going to want to connect with you online, you're very active on social media. Where can people find you? How can they best, interact with you, if you will?
So you can look my name up, Joe Adomavicia on Facebook, Joe the Poet on Instagram. My email address is on both of those sites, and I take personal messages all the time. I mean, feel free to reach out. I love talking and meeting new people and learning new things.
Well, thanks so much, Joe. It was a real pleasure having you on the show. And, hopefully when those next 3 books come out, maybe we can do it again.
Most definitely, John. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.